domestic violence, violence by intimate partners in the home. And we're now at about the 5th week of my class. It's the center of the class. And I put violence at the center because I happen to think that violence is a key, a kind of paradigm issue for our time. It is the strategy of people who are in power to maintain power. Somebody gets out of line, a kid gets out of line, you smack them or something. A person talks back, a person doesn't have dinner on the table in time, you shove her across the room. A country gets out of line, we bomb them. I mean, essentially, violence is the strategy of people in power to maintain the status quo. And I think that if we are interested in transforming our lives, changing to new paradigms of the way that we interact with each other, we have to deal with this issue of violence. And I see it as central, so I put it in the center of my course, around the 5th week or so. We then move from violence to talking about work. And I'm sorry, the week after that, we moved to talking about women in conflict and refugee circumstances. The vast majority of refugees are, in fact, women and children. Huge numbers of people moving because of natural disasters, because of wars. I mean, all over the world, people are moving from one place to another. And the circumstance of people as refugees, particularly women and children, is extremely vulnerable. They're extremely vulnerable. I mean, what happens to women in terms of their health and human rights is totally outrageous in a war and refugee circumstance. We'll move on, we'll come back if you like. But onward to the next topic, which I look at work, globalization and work, and focus in on those kinds of activities that women engage in order to get cash. When I was working at the Global Fund for Women and I traveled and would interview women and meet women all over the world, I would often say, what are your major issues? What issues come to mind as those that women in this country would be most concerned about? And the two issues that always came up were violence and access to money, needing money, work, whatever. So when we look at work, we look at one possibility that has provided money for women, and that is work, cheap labor, being cheap labor in export-producing zones, and making all of the products that can be, exported back to us. Cheap factories, clothing factories. If we were to look at our labels on and we might want to do that later, and everybody look at the label on their clothes, where was your shirt made, where were your shoes made, we'd probably come up with 30 different countries. And in many, many, if not all, of those places, our stuff is made in factories to a great extent run by women, not run by women so much as where women are working, because they're cheaper to hire, and people move from country to country for cheaper labor, and cheaper labor means younger women. Women take this up. They are recruited out of villages in places, all over the place, the Philippines, Malaysia, China, parts of Africa, all over the place, and they are recruited, and one might say, well, isn't that good? I mean, after all, they're leaving the village, and they're going to town, and they're actually getting a job, and they're paid money. And in some ways it is, and in some ways they are taught skills. But in some ways it isn't, in the sense that they are uprooted from their communities, and in many cases it's very difficult for them and dangerous for them to move into urban centers where they aren't protected by the usual social protections. So work, that's one aspect of women's work, good aspect that's come with globalization, and bad in some ways, but for the most part maybe good, maybe offering jobs for people. Something else that's come along and absolutely blossomed with globalization is sex trafficking, and I focus on that. Why? Because the women who were writing to the Global Fund for Women highlighted all these. These are their issues. These are their issues. These are the issues that those women came together to create groups around, to try to do something about these issues. So I look at sex trafficking. I don't want to go into detail about it, but it's a huge industry. Worldwide, almost every country is a receiving or a supplying country in the world. It's unbelievable when you hear, there's a colleague of mine at Stanford is an expert on Eastern Europe, and she's, it's outrageous what is happening to women in terms of their being trafficked across borders. Well, there's more to say about that. So globalization. Finally, we come to aging. My favorite place. Anyway, aging and what happens to women when they age. And here's one where we don't know very much because very few studies have been done about older women in poorer countries, which is the focus. And but we do know that older women are important and invisible, and for the most part poor, for the most part illiterate, for the most part suffering from ill health. Much of what happened through life as they become old, and what we mean by old can range from 40, 50 to up to 70 or 80, I suppose. But there are the aging women who are really, as I say, without question, the majority of them are poor, isolated, illiterate, and so on. However, they're also very important. And in parts of the world, as we know, older women are caring for younger people, orphans, and many of them in East Africa. So the conceit that I used was a woman's life, to look from infancy through old age. I may have forgotten a couple of the issues. And I began to teach the class and look in vain for a textbook. So I decided to write the book. I won't bore you with the story of how I came about it. I had no intention of doing this. But I had written another book about the Global Fund, the founding of the Global Fund, and I was encouraged to do this by a publisher who said, you know, if you do it, I'll publish it, which was nice. And so I didn't have to go around looking, which was great. But so I did publish the book, and the book follows that life of a woman with that introduction on, about human rights all the way through, and then a final chapter which discusses the women's movement, the international women's